Somewhere near Kamyanka, with the support of armored vehicles, Russian infantry is steadily increasing pressure on the Ukrainian defenders of the Pokrovsk Myrnohrad agglomeration. Do the defense forces of Ukraine have the means to save the ruins of both cities and, most importantly, to prevent our defenders there from being encircled? Corruption schemes of enormous scale within Ukraine, how do they affect the resilience of the front, and what are the purely internal roots of these notorious embezzlements? The situation is extremely difficult in the Huliaipole and Oleksandrivka directions. The enemy's Vostok military group is advancing there every day. There are currently not many signs that the Russians will be stopped in the Zaporizhzhia region. Hello everyone. This is the latest operational review project from the editorial team at Spetskorum. To understand the geography of the front as usual, we will use the online map, Deep State Map, for which the developers have granted us permission to use in the program. And today's special guest is Dmytro Zhmail, Executive Director of the Ukrainian Center for Security and Cooperation. Mr. Dmytro, welcome and thank you for finding the time to join us. We simply cannot avoid discussing the corruption of truly gigawatt proportions that has emerged at the outset. Some of the materials from the lengthy NABU investigations which were made public last week actually did not come as a bolt from the blue at all. Here it's more appropriate to use the word finally, because at last something serious has shaken Ukraine and the ripples have reached many corners of the world. There, it's openly about insane amounts of money, the possible involvement of top-level officials, and in some cases, it's not even an exception to talk about outright state treason. If the money really was going to Moscow, supposedly all these revelations have no direct and immediate impact on the front line, but that's only if you completely close your eyes and cover your ears. After all, we're talking about embezzlement in the energy sector, which the enemy tries to destroy every week with missiles and drones. We're talking about money, tens of millions and not in hryvnias, that Ukraine desperately needs, money that should have been spent on electronic warfare equipment, shells, missiles, and much more. Things that Ukrainian soldiers at the front and those defending infrastructure and civilians in the rear are in dire need of. So this money simply settled and stuck in private pockets. And moreover, it ended up in the pockets of people who are far from being underprivileged. All suspicions and accusations will be proven in court. At the very least, there is a cautious hope that the people involved will actually end up on the defendant's bench. But the worst and most threatening thing is that Ukraine, as a country fighting for its existence and survival, has taken a very serious blow to the gut. As for reputational losses, that's a separate issue altogether, and the consequences are still not fully understood at this point. Dmytro, this sky-high, outrageous corruption, does it directly affect the front and, just as importantly, our ability as a country to effectively resist Moscow?
Mr. Alexander, it definitely has an indirect impact because these are funds that never reach the military, this is equipment that was never purchased, and this also includes the embezzlement of funds from our Western partners. And there must be zero tolerance for those responsible for these schemes. This is personally painful for me because every broadcast is supposed to raise funds for the military. When you see such astronomical sums, it is very, very disheartening. But I have two major questions. That is, it's important to separate the issue of corruption from the issue of our continued resistance. The fact that such high-profile crimes are being uncovered in Ukraine during martial law still shows that our anti-corruption agencies are working and the consensus that was reached still exists. But we are in a war of attrition. And right now, the one who will win is the one who can endure the longest. And if we separate all these cases so that the guilty are actually brought to justice, that's one story. But continuing our resistance is also important. The world is accepting our idea of freezing the war, of ceasing hostilities. We are changing the support in America. In particular, Republicans are increasingly supporting Ukraine. There is a huge lobbying effort here by both Zelensky, the office, and also by military figures like Pavlo Palisa. And now Russia is trying to get out of this whole situation. We still need, no matter what, to show wisdom so that the corrupt end up behind bars and our resistance accordingly continues. So far, the world is responding positively. But now what both the democratic forces in the US and many of our partners in the West want is to launch the election process and in fact initiate a reboot of the government. And a new government, which by definition will not be able to solve all the problems, is an opportunity for additional pressure and for imposing certain points of capitulation on us. And this could lead to a situation where they tell official Kiev, you know guys, just withdraw from Donetsk region and let this end now. And what happens next, especially after Trump's term, will be dealt with later. It's a difficult period. There are no clear-cut solutions. The corrupt must be held accountable, and the front must continue to resist. The soldiers I talk to say, yes, it does have an impact. It's very, very demoralizing, but to be honest, their main concern is their operational and tactical tasks and keeping people alive in the region, and about holding their positions.
Let's take a direct look at the front line of combat. Let's start today with the southern Slobozansky direction. To be precise, with a rather narrow, perhaps the smallest sector of the front around Vovchansk. The front line there remained almost unchanged for a very long time. It held, and this is thanks, it's worth emphasizing, thanks to the truly titanic resilience of our soldiers. Because all the enemy's forces were thrown in with insane intensity. For a long time, the front line began from the more southeastern Muscovite Murom, passed through the northern backwaters, crossed the Siversky Donets between Buruvatka and Prilipka, then ran along the northern bank of the Vovcha River and passed through the city. And along that same northern bank it entered Zatiki, and at the level of the Vovchansk farmsteads it turned north again toward the border. But approximately at the line, on October 18th to 19th, the Russians, mainly the forces operating there, primarily the 44th Rashid Army Corps, the Sever Troop Grouping, and in particular the newly formed 128th Motorized Rifle Brigade, as well as with support from the 1009th Motorized Rifle Regiment, first increased their offensive efforts in the western part of Vovchansk itself, where the Russians managed to crawl along the railway branch and seize territory of the destroyed oil extraction plant. And apparently by the morning, at the very least, their presence was established in the area where the Vovchansk railway station used to be. A little later, already in the first 10 days of November, the Russians significantly increased the pressure to the west of Vovchansk itself, attacking through the forest. From Hatishe in the direction of Sinelnikov with Tsehelny. But at least the information currently available from open sources indicates that Ukrainian defenders are not letting the Russians into Sinelnikov itself. At the same time in Vovchansk as well, further along the bend of Inativ Street, which actually passes through the Vovchansk oil extraction plant and the railway station. There shouldn't be any Russians there, but there was an attempt by the Rashists to break through. Up to the intersection of Rubizhansky Highway and Soborna Street, which is, roughly speaking, the entrance to the city from the southern direction via the T-2104 highway, or more simply, from the direction of Stary Saltiv. At least such an attempt was made around November 8th to 9th. Whether the Russians used vehicles there or if it was just infantry attacking is still unclear, but what is certain is that after more than a year and a half of virtually non-stop artillery shelling, extremely intense close-quarters firefights and airstrikes, there is absolutely nothing left of Vovchansk. To find out what the situation is now around Vovchansk and among the total devastation within the city itself, I hope to hear from Ruslana Bodan, head of the communications department of the 57th Separate Motorized Infantry Brigade, named after Kostya Hordienko, who is already connected with the Spetskorps studio. Ms. Ruslana, welcome.
Thank you.
Before I ask my question, I want to draw viewers' attention. A QR code should appear on your screens. This is a fundraiser for drones, for drones, for drones, for drones, and again for drones. They are very much needed by our soldiers, especially under such intense attacks from the occupiers in urban areas, even those not yet destroyed. So please, do not stand aside from helping our defenders. Ms. Ruslana, we spoke with Dmytro around the turn of the 1st, 18th, and 19th of October, right in the city itself. This Moscow military group Sever has, let's say, significantly increased the intensity of its offensive attacks, even though for a long time the Ukrainian defense forces managed to hold back the attacks of the Russians and keep them mostly on the northern bank. What changed in this area from October 1st to 20th, and then again around November 3rd to 6th, that the enemy became more active in this direction and started to achieve what they are now achieving?
Nothing changed in the fall, not in October, not in November. The change happened in the summer, when the Russians began their summer attempt to capture the city during their offensive. We know that they had such an order, and we know that the command of the regiment that failed to fully capture Vovchansk over the summer was removed from their positions. However, enemy activity did not actually decrease after that. The tactic of small infantry groups, 1 or 2 people, they gather together. They try to storm, supported by aviation, both tactical and strategic. Also artillery, thermobaric weapons. Everything is flying here, everything is working here. In our direction, fiber optics are actively used. Among them, we notice elite units and UAVs. That's why this situation has been dragging on since the summer. And in fact, the strip that was on deep state for a long time, and the fact that we held our positions for so long, that's an achievement. It's thanks to the infantry, again the infantry, who sometimes serve without rotation. We had people sitting in positions as is known for 180 days, and now it's more than 200. And all this time, people are not just staying there, they are simultaneously destroying enemy infantry forces.
Ruslan, since you've already touched on this topic, let me ask then, both in Vovchansk and to the west of the city, when these intense bursts of enemy activity flare up, are these mostly close quarters infantry battles that our defenders are fighting now, or is it more of a remote war using drones and primarily artillery support?
It's a combination. And you can't separate one from the other. Because, for example, if the Russians fail to destroy a position with artillery or aviation, they try to send in enemy infantry again. If the first group doesn't succeed, the second group doesn't succeed, and the third group doesn't succeed either. And then the whole story with artillery and aviation starts all over again. And it's a vicious cycle where they just storm head on and keep trying. At any cost, with the support of all available forces and means, they try to actually take the city and its outskirts. And there's nothing they haven't used here. Nuclear weapons are the only thing they haven't deployed.
Ruslan, you already mentioned the Salt-Sepyok systems in just a few sentences. I know there was information that the Russians sent a fresh batch of TOS-1 Alpha to the front. Has the use of these heavy flamethrower systems increased in your sector? Because Levchansk has always stood out for having a lot of this kind of non-Russian weaponry.
Yes, and in fact, since summer, the Salt-Sepyok systems have been actively operating, and in general, they're still in use, not just the Salt-Sepyok systems. I personally saw on live streams how a Smerch would just drive out from Shebekino, from the industrial zone, and start shelling our positions. And you can literally see it with a drone, by the way, a Mavic drone, the kind we're currently fundraising for. You can see it right from Ukrainian territory. Regarding evacuation, civilians remain in Vovchansk, and there are still a few people living in Vilcha, which is quite close to Vovchansk. So there are still people there. At first, our people evacuated a lot of civilians. It's true, in the first days they were taking people out of Vovchansk, persuading them to leave, and at that time there was still the opportunity and time to do so. Now, this is the responsibility of the military administration. There are civilians in the sector. There are people in Zarychne, in Buhaivka, and in Stary Saltiv as well. And just recently in Starovi Saltiv, well, I don't go there that often, but maybe it was just a coincidence. In the hour we were there were 3 FPV drones. Wow, that's quite far away.
That actually says a lot about the range at which they're being used. Understood. Ruslana, thank you very much for answering these questions in such detail. Please take care of yourself and your comrades. Thank you. Dmytro, it's clear that the Russians are attacking everywhere they can, and so to speak, they're adding forces and resources to reinforce wherever they manage to. But why now, and why specifically Vovchansk? Well, Ruslan is on the ground and sees things more clearly, but it seems to me that there was a wave there in July, and now this is the second one. Why exactly now, and why Vovchansk in particular? Is it just happening here by chance, or does Moscow have some deeper and longer-term goal?
There's more of a political logic here. First of all, the Sumy direction. Let me remind you that the Russians wanted to create a 10 to 15 kilometer buffer zone there. They withdrew almost all combat units and brought in newly formed motorized rifle units, including those recruited from the sick. Then there's the issue of Kupiansk directly. We can see that no matter what, their avalanche stalled. They spent a long time crossing and expanding the bridgehead in the direction of Dvorichna. And in this way, they tried to quickly seize the city. Right now, our counter-sabotage operations are ongoing there. We know that the 429th Achilles Regiment is working very effectively there. And now the Russians need to present some other image of victory. To put it simply, they need to paint more of the deep state map red. So accordingly, they tried to break through further south. We managed to stop them somewhat by striking the Belgorod Dam, where they were subsequently flooded. Now what we see is that, for now, Kupiansk is not working out for them. They haven't managed to achieve this victory. They tried to attack further east, specifically towards the Vovchansk hamlets, and attempted a breakthrough in the Milov area. And now the main objective is simply to create this kind of quasi-corridor along the border, where the river runs, in fact, essentially a buffer security zone, and in this way to demonstrate that a so-called sanitary zone has been established along the Russian-Ukrainian border. We weren't positioned right on the state border itself. We were stationed about 5 to 7 kilometers away. There are certain elevations there which we tried to control. It makes sense. When defending, you should always hold the high ground. And that's why the Russians, taking advantage of their numerical superiority and the diversion of our reserves to more critical directions, will try, bluntly speaking, to paint everything along the border solid red and present it as a major political victory. Right now, a major battle is taking place on the diplomatic front. Why are the Russians burning everything down? Because the Ukrainian proposal for a freeze has been accepted, and they need at least something. They need to paint as much as possible red and present it as an advantage. In Sumy region, they failed. There, to put it mildly, they broke their teeth. Now here they are trying to create this very illusion of their victory. More still,
another sector of the front that, without exaggeration, draws daily attention both in Ukraine and I think far beyond its borders is the section of the front around Pokrovsk. Specifically, its northeastern Myrnohrad flank. And this is a sector of the front where more than 100 combat clashes are taking place, making it for a week now the most intense area in terms of the sheer number of engagements. The Muscovites, as it turns out, are currently deploying the main forces of the Rashid 2nd Combined Arms Army, primarily the 27th Motorized Rifle Division, as well as the 15th and 30th Motorized Rifle Brigades, attacking along a rather wide front from Molodetske through this city, and all the way to Chinushain and Dashinske further east, actually even further east to be precise, beyond the EM30 National Highway. And it should be noted that specifically in the Chinushain-Dachinsky section, the Russians are also deploying certain, at least some groups from their rather atypical 55th Mountain Motorized Rifle Brigade. And this is a unit of the 41st Combined Arms Army, most of which is fighting much further south on the front. So it seems that as of this moment, the Russians have apparently managed to secure, as you already mentioned, at least the entire length of defenders of Ukraine Street, that is the M30 highway within Pokrovsk. Moreover, they've managed to advance further north into the area bounded by Ivan, Mazepa, and Shevchenko streets up to the local multi-track railway. At the same time, the eastern part of the central district, the Sobachivka area, as well as the adjacent eastern neighborhoods of Ri and Hnativka and the northernmost blocks of the city, all of these remain in the so-called gray zone. But the Russian attacks form a broad semicircle starting from the area of Udachne and gradually advancing in a steady manner toward the main highway that leads to Pavlohrad, moving directly along the well-known M30 road. This maneuver is intended to cover more ground and ensure a secure approach, with a focus on Hrishain and the abandoned airfield for agricultural aviation there, directly to the north in the city and to the east, so these attacks practically do not stop for even an hour. I would venture to suggest that the intersection of Mazepa Street, which we've already mentioned today, here it goes, and Dobropilska Street, actually in the Rivne area, is now a place, one of the most heavily shelled places, because this is exactly where the T0515 highway begins, which connects Pokrovsk with the key northern rear and which the Russians are trying to completely cut off physically at any cost. It's really just simple math. The thing is, this route is what the other road, H32, turns into, which near Rivne becomes T05. 515, the main logistical artery currently connecting to Myrnohrad. Another issue is that this road is actually under constant, uninterrupted enemy fire control. It is attacked from different sides by both drones and artillery. But the fact remains, this road exists, and most importantly, at least, on the stretch from the eastern outskirts of Myrnohrad to that same Rivne, this road has not been physically cut off by the enemy as of today. The situation in Myrnohrad, particularly in its southern part, significantly escalated in the second half of last week. It appears that the Moscow military group on the traverse of Kozatske and Promin managed to break into the urban area. There are different views on this situation, but at the very least, the highest local points are the slag heaps of Mine 5 to 6, reaching up to 260 meters in height, are now at the very least in a contested area. But the most pessimistic sources indicate that it is possible that enemy forces, specifically assault groups primarily from, first of all, the 348th Motorized Rifle Regiment and the 5th Motorized Rifle Brigade, which was likely redeployed from the Dobropilya direction to this very sector sometime last week, managed to get through Tolbukin Lane, which crosses the main local street, Soborna. Myrnohrad is very elongated, and they managed to gain a foothold near the local platform 11 by the railway embankment. At the same time, the intensity of enemy attacks on Myrnohrad in the northern sector has not decreased and may have even increased. The Muscovites are pressing mainly with the forces of their 132nd and 9th separate motorized rifle brigades of the 51st Combined Arms Army. South of Rodenske through Krasny Lyman and from the direction of Novokonomishne directly along the H32 highway via Rodenske and Krasny Lyman, targeting routes such as T0515. And it is not out of the question that from the eastern flank, the Muscovites have also involved their own forces in the attacks. The 56th Separate Battalion of the Special Operations Forces and the 3rd Spetsnaz Brigade of the GRU General Staff. At the same time, there is information that another, the 72nd SOF Battalion, is likely operating in the southern part of Myrnohrad. A few details about the situation around Myrnohrad and in the city itself. I hope we now have the opportunity to hear from the spokesperson of the Korsar Unmanned Systems Battalion of the 38th Separate Marine Brigade, Oleksiy Hodzenko, who is joining us live. Oleksiy, greetings.
Greetings, my friend. Glory to Ukraine.
Glory to the heroes. First of all, as usual, I drew the viewers' attention. The QR code is on your screens. This is a fundraiser for special strike drones for the Korsar Battalion of the 38th Brigade. According to Oleksiy himself, these UAVs cause a lot of damage to the enemy. So please, don't stay on the sidelines. Join in and help our Marines. My friend, first of all, I have to ask directly. Is the enemy currently in Myrnohrad?
Let's put it this way. We've all seen the videos more than once. You've seen the videos of the enemy being driven out of the streets of Myrnohrad. That is, sometimes their assaults, sometimes thanks to the weather, end up being successful. And we have to go in and finish them off in close combat.
Tell me, can we say that around Myrnohrad and in the city itself? Well, as we've mentioned today, the city is very spread out. It's over 8 kilometers. Is there currently a clearly defined line of contact, or is the situation the same as it was at the beginning of November in Pokrovsk? In other words, are Ukrainian positions mixed with some hideouts of the occupiers, making it impossible to track a clear line of engagement?
Look, for the past couple of weeks, there have been very heavy fogs here in Donbass, and thanks to them, they are breaking through into the city. Let me put it this way. I can't speak specifically about our positions. I don't want to help the Russians with that, but the front line in this area is generally a bit fluid everywhere. Still, our guys are holding their positions and repelling enemy attacks, even though it's extremely, extremely difficult.
Oleksiy, let's say the open sources available for analysis show that between the main, let's say, enemy formations in Pokrovsk and in Krasny Lyman, that is these, so to speak, flanks of this semi-encirclement, the distance is about 10 kilometers. Meanwhile, between the edges of the so-called gray zone, it's no more than 2.5 kilometers. And from both sides, as we already mentioned in today's review, this is pressure on the H32, pressure on the 0.5 to 15, meaning the supply routes. Hence the relevant question which was raised last week, and I think is still relevant today. Do our soldiers still have the ability to maintain communication with, for those who are on the front lines? Is there still a connection with the rear? Is it possible to deliver supplies and evacuate the wounded? In other words, is it still possible to somehow reinforce our infantrymen who are on the front line?
Look, the fog I mentioned earlier, it's something that works both ways. That is, thanks to the weather conditions and the professional actions of our soldiers, both rotations and evacuations are taking place, and logistics are being carried out as well. In addition, the Korsar Battalion, the Battalion of Unmanned Systems, is very actively involved in logistics. And we have bombers who are now not so much bombing as handling logistics, and there are also ground robotic complexes that are doing this as well. So in this regard, they have taken on the substantial lion's share of the logistics operations.
Oleksiy, this week several videos appeared online showing the explosions of 3-ton Russian aerial bombs in Myrnohrad. Unfortunately, this in itself is no longer news. But if we talk about the dynamics, the intensity of the enemy's use of glide bombs, and therefore aviation, has the intensity remained about the same all this time? Or has something changed in this regard? If so, in which direction and how exactly?
In fact, the intensity has been very high for a long time now. It's even hard to say whether it has increased recently. In reality, when you're sitting at some command post or something, reports come in every few minutes. Glide bombs are being used constantly. This is done to quickly relay information down the chain so that people in Myrnohrad can make decisions about their safety. There are a lot of glide bombs.
I understand in the end, as they say, it's not really about the salary, but I don't see any point in sugarcoating reality. Tell me, is there a possibility, let's say, if not to take back what the enemy has seized, then at least to push the enemy back in order to improve the connection with the front line? In the end, we are now in for a longer period. Or is the balance of forces in the sector already so disproportionate that the real issue is ensuring the safe withdrawal of our defenders from this, well, I don't want to use the word pocket, but in fact, that's what it is.
Friend, look, honestly, this is above my pay grade. This isn't even a battalion or brigade level issue. It's a question for the higher command. However, they are well aware of what's happening there. The Russians are bringing in reinforcements, and our side is deploying some reserves and other units. This isn't a secret, it's standard military practice. Then let's put it this way, we don't have any kind of doubt. We're soldiers after all, and we follow orders. Still, of course, we sincerely hope and continue to wish for some meaningful stabilization of the situation on the front line. And we believe in ourselves, we believe in our comrades, in our neighbors.
Also, Oleksiy, thank you very much for your detailed account. Oleksiy Hodzenko, spokesperson for the Korsar Unmanned Systems Battalion of the 38th Separate Marine Brigade, was in touch with the Spetskory studio. Dmytro, the same question goes to you since you are not directly involved. Do you believe there is a scenario, perhaps the Ukrainian headquarters have some kind of plan B, C, or D, I don't know? If not to completely liberate Pokrovsk, then at least to push the enemy back beyond the M30 on this side, to push them back a bit in Myrnohrad, so that at the very least logistics can be restored and, in principle, enough defending forces can be brought in. Has the critical moment come for withdrawal, and is there a need to withdraw primarily from this section southeast of Pokrovsk?
I think the most likely scenario is the most positive middle option. I don't think it's possible to push them back at this point because the concentration of forces is actually very, very high. Right now, we are really trying to secure our logistics because the Russians are once again advancing from Hrodivka. We had our own small barriers here, but they are pushing through them using both their personnel and equipment. So these aren't demoners or anything, they're just pushing forward, plain and simple. In addition, the defense forces. It was our aviation that struck, apparently with guided aerial bombs, right on this artery to make it more difficult for them to move with light vehicles. That's why we see that recently a gray zone has formed, which means our troops are pulling back so they don't end up surrounded. We saw videos where, under the cover of fog, equipment was being pulled in. Most of it, according to the 7th Air Assault Corps, was destroyed. Then there were shots which no one commented on, showing it being dragged without the fog. Most likely, this is exactly the section being discussed, because our positions were here. And then, in order not to be surrounded, we withdrew as far south as possible, which allowed the Russians to move in. Therefore, the most optimistic scenario possible is stabilization. Accordingly, along the railway or here in Myrnohrad, there are high-rise buildings in the eastern part, which provide certain elevation advantages. In Rodenske, there is constant back and forth between our troops. Last week, we cleared Rodenske, but now the Russians are advancing again. So this bottleneck remains. Overall, this semicircle will remain relevant as long as we keep sending in reserves. If we run out of reserves, there will be special forces, SSO, VSP, and assault troops. Everything best we have is there. So accordingly, we keep them locked in these ruins for as long as possible. If that no longer makes sense, then it's a withdrawal. To the north, there are 3 lines of defense all the way to Dobropilya. But why are we still holding on? That's the key question. So that if we do have to withdraw, as few enemy troops as possible break through there. Because it's better to hold them in the ruins, and when the Russians, especially after Avdiivka, as we remember, move out into the open fields, into operational space, it's very, very hard to stop them, like cockroaches. That's why Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad are for now like matchboxes that we're trying to hold on to and simply erase them there for as long as possible.